The city had been reduced to rubble. Once a thriving metropolis, now only smoldering wreckage remained, glass, steel, and concrete crushed beneath the weight of war. The sky was a dull shade of gray, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and fire. Drone shadows cut across the wreckage, their high-pitched whirs a constant reminder of the ever-present surveillance. Jack stood on the edge of a rooftop, his silhouette swallowed by the twilight. His helmet, a sleek matte black design, obscured most of his face, save for the faint glow of the HUD display reflected in his eyes. The sleek combat suit he wore clung to his body like a second skin, hard as iron and light as air. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the anticipation of the hunt. He was an operator, a specialist in precision, a machine of war. His mission was clear: eliminate the rebel faction hiding in the ruins of the city. Not with guns, not with explosives, but with nanobots, deploying nanites, he muttered to himself, fingers moving over the console embedded in his arm. With a slight adjustment to his targeting system, he launched the swarm. A few seconds passed. Then, in an almost imperceptible shift, he felt it. A buzz in the back of his mind, like static electricity crawling over his skin. The nanobots, millions of microscopic machines, spread out through the environment, targeting the rebel forces hidden within the ruined cityscape. Each bot was a pinpoint of destruction. It would target biological markers in the enemy's cells, wiping out the very essence of their existence. No bloodshed. No mess. Just precise, clean eradication. Jack smiled thinly. The job was simple. He'd done it 1,000 times, but this time, something was different. Hours earlier, the briefing had been typical. A high-ranking officer in a sterile, windowless room. Images of the enemy's hideout. A map dotted with potential targets. But there was an undercurrent to this mission that Jack couldn't quite place, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. The mission parameters are clear, Jack. Use the nanobots to neutralize all targets inside the building. We've made sure the strike will be exact. Your mission is to clear the area. Understood. Jack's voice had been low, controlled. He didn't ask questions. He never did, but as he stood there, scanning the battlefield below, he began to feel off. Something in the air, perhaps, or just a nagging thought in the back of his mind. Was it the mission itself? The setup? The target? His mind was always sharp, always in control, but this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He pushed the thought aside. Focus. No room for distractions. The mission was everything. It was the only thing. As the nanobot spread across the city like a wave, Jack felt the buzz again, but this time it was different. More intense. Something had shifted in his body. His muscles twitched, his heartbeat quickened, and his skin tingled with an unfamiliar warmth. He paused. A sudden rush of nausea hit him, but it was gone before he could even register it fully. He staggered, just a little, but it was enough for him to notice. What was happening to him? His body felt lighter, almost like he was floating, but his vision grew sharper, the landscape below snapping into crystal clear focus. His senses were amplifying. Jack, report, came the voice from his earpiece, sharp and insistent. He didn't answer immediately. He was too busy staring at his own hands. The skin, his skin, seemed wrong. He flexed his fingers, watching in disbelief as his knuckles shifted, became harder. His reflexes, too. Faster. His breathing steadied, and a strange sense of calm washed over him. This wasn't part of the plan. Jack, the voice repeated. It was his commanding officer, Cole. I'm fine. Continue the mission, Jack said, though his voice sounded off even to himself. His thoughts were a little slower now, like they had to catch up with his body. He couldn't focus entirely on the mission anymore. He didn't understand what was happening. But he had no time to think it through. The enemy was still out there. He could feel their presence, like heat radiating from the ruins. They were close, too close. With a quick exhale, he set his jaw and jumped from the rooftop. When he landed in the rubble, his legs absorbed the shock of the fall effortlessly. He didn't even stumble. He was already in the building before his mind caught up with the motion. He moved faster than he ever had before, every step taken with precision and power, his senses heightening with each second. His HUD flashed, marking enemy targets as he moved through the shadows, and he launched another wave of nanobots into the air. They spread like locusts, seeking out the enemy's genetic markers, rendering them vulnerable, and dismantling them from within. At first, the results were as expected. Enemies fell one by one, their life force vanishing like a puff of smoke. But then Jack began to feel something else. A sensation deep inside him, a gnawing pull, like the threads of his very DNA were being rewritten. It was almost as if the nanobots were changing him, too. His thoughts, once clear and controlled, became clouded. His movements were no longer just mechanical, they were instinctive, primal. He reached for the next target, a rebel soldier cowering in a corner. As Jack stepped into the room, the soldier froze, eyes wide with terror. Jack's chest tightened, but it wasn't fear. It was hunger. Not for food, no, it was something darker, something more intense. The soldier moved to shoot. But Jack was faster. In an instant, the soldier's weapon flew from his hands, and Jack's fist collided with his chest. The rebel's body crumpled under the force of the blow, and Jack, he didn't know what came over him, grabbed the soldier's neck and squeezed. The man gasped for breath, his eyes bulging. Jack's grip tightened. "Please, stop." The soldier's voice was strangled, but Jack wasn't listening. There was something inside him urging him to keep going, to absorb it all, to take what he could. To be stronger. With a final snap, he let go. The soldier crumpled to the ground, lifeless. As Jack stood over the fallen body, he suddenly felt the full weight of what he had done. He felt the rush of power, but it left him hollow. The soldier's memories were there, flashing in his mind, a blur of faces, of voices, of experiences. They were his, now, but were they? Who was he, really? Was he still Jack? Or had he become something else entirely? The nanobots were still working, still reshaping him. He could feel them, deep inside his veins, altering his cells, rewriting his DNA. He flexed his hand, watching as the soldier's memories continued to flood his mind, his name, his past, his hopes, his fears. Jack's heart pounded. He was losing himself. He had to stop. He had to get out. The mission continued, but Jack wasn't the same. His body was stronger, faster, more lethal than it had ever been. But his mind was beginning to unravel. Every rebel he killed, every cell he absorbed, chipped away at the person he used to be. His memories, his thoughts, began to blur with theirs. The lines between who he was and who he had become started to fade. Jack didn't know if he could stop it. He didn't know if he even wanted to. The deeper Jack pushed into the rebel stronghold, the more his senses seemed to betray him. He was moving fast, faster than any human should, but there was no thrill in it, no exhilaration. He felt distant from it all, as though his own body wasn't his anymore. The weight of his actions was starting to press on him, heavy like a stone in his chest. Every rebel he eliminated, every life extinguished, he absorbed their memories, flashes of faces, the fleeting moments of their lives, their fears and desires. It was too much. Too much to process. His hands were trembling. He passed through another set of crumbling walls, the remnants of what used to be a corridor. The faint sound of movement echoed from somewhere ahead. A group of soldiers huddled around a makeshift command post, unaware of Jack's approach. They spoke in hushed tones, strategizing their next move. But Jack didn't care about their strategy. He could hear their heartbeats, the slight variations in their breathing, the nervous energy in the air. The nanobots in his bloodstream hummed, ready for the kill. Jack's movements were almost instinctive now, like a predator closing in on prey. He exhaled sharply, and before he even realized what he was doing, he was there. One moment he was at the far end of the corridor, the next, he was upon them. His body moved with a fluidity that felt alien, a grace that was almost inhuman. The first soldier didn't have time to react. Jack reached out with a speed that made the man's eyes widen in terror. A single touch to his throat and the soldier crumpled to the ground, choking. The others scrambled, reaching for their weapons. But Jack was already on them. He grabbed one by the wrist and twisted, snapping bone with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, but Jack silenced him with a punch to the jaw. His other hand reached for another, grabbing the soldier's arm and yanking him into a devastating knee to the ribs. The last man tried to run, but Jack was faster. He moved like a blur, catching up to the soldier before he even reached the door. He pulled the man back, twisting his neck with a sudden, brutal motion. It was over. Jack stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen soldiers. His chest was rising and falling in heavy breaths, but there was no exhilaration, no sense of victory. Only emptiness. A hollow feeling gnawed at his gut as he looked down at the men he had just killed, their faces frozen in shock and pain. Their memories. His head swam with flashes of their lives, distant parents, lovers, children. Lives he had no right to know, no right to take. He staggered back, nearly losing his balance. His vision blurred, his mind unable to sort through the flood of foreign thoughts. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the memories refused to go away. A voice. A soft whisper, like a distant echo, cut through the chaos in his head. It was coming from the soldier whose neck he had snapped last. "You're becoming one of them." The thought hit him like a slap, and he stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, he could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heart, the frantic beat of his pulse as if his body itself was trying to fight off the invasion, the nanobots. They were doing this. They were changing him. Jack's fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. He looked at the bodies again, the soldiers he had just murdered, and for the first time since he had arrived, he questioned what he was doing. Who he was becoming. He had always prided himself on being a soldier. A tool. A weapon. He had never asked questions. He had never needed to. But now, he didn't know who he was anymore. He moved past the bodies, his feet heavy on the ground. The place felt like it was closing in on him, the walls shifting, the air thick with the weight of his transformation. He needed to finish the mission. He needed to clear the building. But it felt like the building itself was shifting beneath him. Was it the nanobots? Or had the flood of memories and experiences from the men he'd absorbed begun to mess with his mind? The doors to the next room were ajar. He pushed through them, stepping into a large open space. There was no one there, but the air was thick with tension, almost as if someone, or something, was waiting. Jack hesitated, and then, from the shadows, a voice rang out, "You're a soldier, Jack. But you're not just a soldier anymore, are you?" The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He turned sharply, his hand moving instinctively to the gun holstered at his side. There, standing in the shadows, was someone Jack knew very well. The face was older, grimmer, but Jack would never forget it. "You." Jack's voice came out as a growl. The figure stepped forward, his features becoming clear in the dim light. It was Marcus, Jack's childhood friend. The man he had been told was dead. The man Jack had thought was lost in a mission years ago. Marcus looked the same as always, though his eyes were darker now, colder. "I guess you didn't get the memo. You've been changed, Jack. You're more than human now. You're a weapon. A perfect weapon." Jack's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but his words stuck in his chest like a lump of ice. He could feel the nanobots inside him, buzzing like angry hornets, urging him to strike, to kill, but Marcus didn't seem afraid. He didn't flinch as Jack stepped toward him, his movements stiff, like a marionette on strings. "You're wrong," Jack finally managed to rasp. "I'm still me." Marcus' laugh was soft, almost sad. "You were never just you, Jack. Don't you see? You were always a tool, a weapon. And now, you're becoming the ultimate weapon." The words cut through Jack like a blade, sharper than anything he had ever felt. The doubt, the confusion, it all hit him like a wave, crashing over him and pulling him under. "I'm not like you," Jack said, his voice strained. "Not yet," Marcus replied. "But you will be. Soon. The nanobots are rewriting you, Jack. Making you stronger, faster. But they're also taking away your humanity. You won't be Jack anymore. You'll be something else." The words echoed in Jack's mind, twisting and turning, until he wasn't sure who was speaking anymore. Was it Marcus? Or was it the voice of the nanobots? The room seemed to close in on him again. His vision wavered, and he could hear the faintest whispers in his head, as if the walls themselves were talking to him, telling him what to do. Telling him that Marcus was the enemy. That he had to kill him. "You're becoming one of them," the voice echoed again. Jack's hand tightened around his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. He could feel his body responding to the command, the urge to act. To kill, but then, something else rose within him. A sliver of doubt. Was he still Jack? Or had he become something else entirely? In the end, he didn't fire. "I don't have to be what they made me," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. For a moment, there was silence, then, Marcus smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "We'll see, Jack. We'll see." And just like that, he was gone. Jack stood in the empty room, alone once again. His chest heaved with the effort of controlling his emotions. His fingers twitched at his sides, longing for the familiar, cold weight of his weapon, but instead, he let it go. For now, there was no going back. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a soldier. But that didn't mean he couldn't fight to get back to himself, somehow. But the question still lingered. Was it too late? The air in the ruined building felt thicker than ever, as though the very walls were pressing in, their damaged surfaces exhaling the last breaths of a civilization long past saving. Jack stood there, frozen in place, his mind churning. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to finish the mission, to erase the enemy and follow orders. But something had snapped inside him. He was no longer just a soldier. He could feel it, the gradual erosion of his humanity, slipping away with every passing second, every life he took, but it was more than just that. It was the flood of memories, the weight of the countless lives he'd absorbed, people who had been nothing more than enemies just hours ago, now embedded in his consciousness. Their fears, their joys, their regrets, all intertwining with his own. Who was he anymore? Jack, or someone else? He shook his head violently, trying to clear it. But it didn't work. It never worked. He could feel the nanobots at work inside him, burrowing deeper, altering his DNA, rewriting his very nature. He could feel them pushing, pulling, demanding that he become more than human, that he embrace the power coursing through his veins, but every time he tried to grab hold of himself, to reach for the last threads of the man he once was, the doubts gnawed at him. Was it too late? Had he already gone too far? Marcus's words echoed in his mind, "You were always a tool, a weapon. And now, you're becoming the ultimate weapon." He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. But deep down, something told him that Marcus was right. Jack had never been more than a soldier, a tool in a war, a weapon to be wielded. And now, it seemed that his transformation was taking him down a path from which there would be no return. The rebel leader's voice came back to him as well, echoing through the confusion. "You can be something more, Jack. You don't have to be bound by their rules anymore." For a brief moment, Jack thought about going to them, joining the rebels, embracing the power that had been gifted to him, becoming the perfect soldier, the weapon without limits. No more pain, no more struggle, just control. Just power. But then he thought about Marcus. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let himself become what they wanted him to be. Not yet. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop this. He turned, moving back through the wreckage, deeper into the heart of the building. The mission still called to him: finish the job, wipe them all out, but something had changed. The deeper he went, the more he realized that there was no clear enemy here. Not anymore. Not in the way he'd been trained to think. There were only shadows, echoes, pieces of the past that refused to fade away. The deeper he went into the rebel stronghold, the more the voices inside his head seemed to grow louder. They weren't just the memories of the people he'd absorbed anymore. Now, they were something else. His thoughts seemed fractured, split between the man he had been, the soldier he was becoming, and something darker still, a presence that felt as if it were pushing him toward some terrible end. "Jack," came a voice from the shadows that he froze. His heart hammered in his chest, his body tensing in preparation for a fight. He didn't recognize the voice at first, but then it came again, this time softer, almost tender. "Jack," it said again, and this time he knew who it was. He turned slowly, his body reacting instinctively, but his mind clouded. In the dim light, standing against the far wall, was a figure he recognized all too well. It was her. Anna. His heart skipped a beat. Her appearance was almost haunting. She was the same as he remembered, but different. Her eyes were harder now, darker, as if the war had aged her more than any amount of time could. She was dressed in tactical gear, her movements controlled, calculated. "A soldier, just like him." "I thought you were dead," Jack said, his voice rough. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, unsure whether to reach for her or run. He didn't know anymore. He didn't know who he was supposed to be. "I know," she said softly, taking a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "I thought the same thing about you." Jack's breath caught in his throat. He could hear the pain in her voice, the years of loss, of betrayal, of being left behind. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he just stared at her, trying to reconcile the face of the woman he once knew with the cold stranger standing before him. Anna was no longer the woman who had once been his partner in battle, someone he trusted implicitly. Now, she was part of this war, part of this world that was pulling them further apart, changing them both in ways they couldn't control. "I don't know what's happening to me," Jack said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I don't know who I am anymore." Anna took a step closer, her hand reaching out toward him. "I know. I've seen it, Jack. I've been watching. The nanobots, they're changing you. You're becoming something else." Jack flinched. He could feel the truth of her words sink deep into his chest. The fear, the dread, it all made sense now. The power, the speed, the voices in his head. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a weapon, one that had already begun to lose control. "I didn't want this," Jack muttered, his head swimming. The memories, the flashes of the people he had killed, the faces of his enemies, it all swirled together in his mind, a dizzying, suffocating mess. Anna's expression softened, but there was no pity in her eyes. Only understanding. "I know. But there's no going back. Not now. You've crossed a line, Jack. You've absorbed too much. The nanobots, they're part of you now. You have to make a choice." Jack looked at her, confused. "A choice?" She nodded. "You can embrace what you are becoming. You can join us, Jack. You can use your power, your strength, to win this war. To make sure it never happens again. Or, you can fight it. But you can't keep pretending like you're still the man you were. Not anymore." Jack's mind raced. The choice she offered him was simple: power, control, a new identity, or the fight for his humanity, a fight he didn't even know if he was capable of winning. It was tempting. He knew it was. The power, the knowledge, the ability to never fear again. To never feel weak, never be vulnerable. It was everything he had ever been trained for, but then, he thought of Marcus's face, the way his old friend had warned him about losing himself. And he thought of Anna, of her gentle eyes, her quiet strength. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling at his sides. "I don't know if I can stop it," he whispered. "I don't know if I want to." Anna stepped closer, her hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, real, something human in the midst of everything else. "You can, Jack. You always could. Don't let them take you." Her words were a lifeline, thrown into the chaos of his mind. For a moment, just a moment, Jack felt like he was holding on to something solid again. But then, the nanobots in his bloodstream surged, a wave of energy crashing through him, forcing him to his knees. His breath hitched, his body spasming with the strain of controlling it. He could feel them, deep inside him, thrumming, alive. They wanted control. They wanted him to stop fighting. Anna stepped back, her face hardening. "You don't have much time. You need to make a choice, Jack. Soon, it'll be too late." The room felt like it was closing in on him. His vision blurred, his muscles aching as the nanobots fought to take control, to make him into something else. That he closed his eyes, fighting the surge of panic, trying to remember who he was. Trying to hold on to something that wasn't this. But he could feel the pull of the power, the pull to embrace it. To let go, the choice was his. The room spun around Jack, as though the world itself was breaking apart into fragments. His body trembled violently, caught between two forces, the overwhelming surge of power within him, and the desperate, fragile thread of his humanity that he fought to hold on to. His pulse raced in his ears, a thundering drumbeat that drowned out everything else. The nanobots were crawling beneath his skin, burrowing deeper, weaving through his cells, altering his very DNA, transforming him into something he wasn't sure he wanted to be. Anna stood a few feet away, watching him with those dark eyes. She didn't move, didn't offer any comfort, but her gaze was full of something deeper, concern, or perhaps understanding. She had made her choice long ago. She had embraced what they were becoming. But Jack was still struggling to keep his grip on the man he used to be. He couldn't let go. Not yet. Not completely. His breath hitched as the nanobots seemed to push harder, making him feel as though his insides were being twisted, reshaped. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he could hear their voices again, clearer than before, whispers like whine through the trees, like the hum of a machine. "We are you now. You can't escape us. Let us take control." He staggered backward, his hand clutching his head as though trying to hold it together. His body wasn't his own anymore. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the raw, burning power coursing through him. "You have to stop fighting it," Anna said, her voice calm, but firm. She stepped closer now, slowly, as though she were walking toward a dangerous animal, one that might strike at any moment. "Jack, you're not the same anymore. You have to accept it." He wanted to shout at her, to tell her she didn't understand, that he hadn't signed up for this mutation, this weaponization of his own body. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt the pull again, the gnawing hunger for power, the desire to be something more, to be free of weakness, free of fear. He had been trained for war, built for war. But this wasn't war anymore. This was something else entirely. "I'm not one of them," he gritted out through clenched teeth, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind splitting in two. One part of him, the soldier, wanted to give in, wanted to embrace the strength, the control. The other part, the man who had once believed in fighting for something greater than himself, was slipping away, fading into the chaos of his own mind. "Don't make this choice for me," Jack spat, his voice hoarse. "I'm still me. I haven't forgotten who I am." But deep down, in the place he didn't want to acknowledge, Jack knew the truth. He was changing. He wasn't the same person anymore. The memories he'd absorbed, those flashes of lives, of emotions, were starting to overtake his own. They were becoming him. The nanobots weren't just reshaping his body. They were reshaping his mind. "I can't let you go down this path," Anna said quietly, her voice tinged with regret. "You don't have to become this thing." Jack's hands clenched into fists. The energy was building inside him, like an inferno, wild and untamed. It was almost unbearable, and he could feel the power pushing against him, trying to force him to embrace it. "I don't have a choice," Jack murmured, barely recognizing his own voice. And then it happened. The ground beneath his feet seemed to quake, and before he could react, a bolt of electricity shot through the air, crackling with raw power. The surge hit him with a force so strong that it sent him to the ground, his body convulsing as though he were being torn apart from the inside out. His vision flickered, his senses overloaded with pain and power. Through the haze, he heard Anna's voice, but it sounded distant, distorted. "Jack! Fight it! You have to fight it!" But the voice wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to break through the madness that was overtaking him. The nanobots had taken over. Jack's body jerked violently, his muscles straining as the transformation accelerated, faster than he could process. His skin felt like it was burning, his veins alive with the hum of electricity. His mind began to fragment, slipping away like water through his fingers. He saw flashes of memories, his own, Anna's, those of the soldiers he had killed, and even the faces of the rebels he had fought against. They all blurred together, becoming one continuous stream of voices, emotions, and desires. He was losing himself, but then, amidst the storm of thoughts and sensations, a single, clear thought pierced through the chaos. "I'm still Jack." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to give him something to hold on to, something to fight for. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Jack focused on that thought, "I'm still Jack." He pushed against the flood of memories, against the nanobots that were attempting to erase his identity, trying to force him to become something else. The power surged within him, a tidal wave that threatened to overwhelm him, but this time, he didn't let it. He fought. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, every cell rebelling against the fight. The nanobots resisted, trying to push him down, to take control. But Jack didn't give up. Not this time. Slowly, the chaos began to subside. The voices in his head started to fade, the grip of the transformation loosening. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling with each painful inhale. He felt exhausted, like he had just run a marathon and fought a battle all at once. When the last of the power ebbed away, Jack collapsed to his knees. Sweat soaked his clothes, his body trembling with the aftermath. But he was still him. The transformation had not taken him completely. He had won, at least for now. Anna was standing over him, her face filled with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You did it," she said softly. Jack looked up at her, his vision still blurred, but his mind clearer now. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," he said, his voice ragged. "The nanobots, they won't stop. It's only a matter of time." Anna nodded grimly. "I know. But you're still Jack. That's what matters." Jack shook his head, not entirely convinced. "How much longer before I lose myself completely? Before I'm nothing but a weapon? A tool for someone else to control?" "I don't know," Anna said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I believe you can still fight it. You're stronger than they know." Jack didn't know if he believed her. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he held on to that small thread of hope. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The building around them groaned and shifted, its walls cracking under the strain of the conflict. Jack's eyes flickered toward the exit, his instincts telling him it was time to move. Time to leave this place. Time to decide what came next, but as he stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, he knew this was far from over. The battle within him had only just begun. And whatever path he chose, there would be no turning back.